Hey everyone, this is a little article from New Compass. It's called Protests Against the Nation by Robert Ogman. Little introduction here. Following the German reunification process in the 1990s, a new anti-national movement appeared in Germany that rejected all forms of nationalism, including the desirability of national communities and the existence of the nation-state itself. In Against the Nation, Robert Ogman covers the background of this movement, the rising neo-Nazism, racist mob violence, restriction in immigration policies, and growing state power, and its urge to organize society around other principles than nationality and borders. By examining the campaigns and documents the various anti-national tendencies in Germany, during this period, Ogman takes a fresh look at the question of nationalism that has haunted the left for more than a century. Against the Nation also provides a hope for an emancipated future based on, quote, something better than the nation, end quote. All right, here's the actual essay, I think. Organizing in nations is part of the problem. Instead of facing and confronting the structural conflicts and contradictions of capitalism, politicians also on the left have sought to, quote, solve, end quote, them within the framework of nation-states. Yet while critiques of nationalism have been articulated by various left figures throughout the 20th century, the emergence of an explicitly anti-national tendency in social movement discourse only first emerged in response to the political conjuncture that began with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The anti-national tendency that emerged in the post-1989 setting had a negative orientation towards the nation. For them, the nation-state was the engine of nationalism, not the means for overcoming nationalism. In no shape or form could, quote, the nation, end quote, be the social force that would or could overthrow capitalism. Nor could it herald in an emancipatory social order or even exist in a post-capitalist society. The abolition of capitalism could not coincide with the nation. Quote, we won't pay for your crisis, end quote. In March 2009, just months after the outbreak of the global economic crisis, 50,000 people marched through the streets of Berlin and Frankfurt declaring, quote, we won't pay for your crisis, end quote. It was part of an international day of protest against the negative material impact endured by the general population for the crisis and neoliberal crisis management. The broad coalition that included labor unions, alter globalization associations, the Left Party, student organizations, anti-capitalist, anti-fascist, and radical left groups brought together widely divergent perspectives regarding the root and potential solution to the crisis. In Frankfurt, this was strongly shown on the question of nationalism. As the Left Party leader, Oscar Lafontaine, began his speech at the closing rally, he only managed to get a few words out before being pelted with eggs by demonstrators who drowned him out, chanting, quote, never again Germany, end quote, and, quote, refugees stay, deport Lafontaine, end quote. The 2,000-person social revolutionary and anti-national bloc who claimed responsibility for the disruption described Lafontaine's appearance as a, quote, provocation, end quote, because of his past support for nationalist positions. As former head of the Social Democratic Party, he signed policies deeply curtailing asylum rights and supported the construction of detention centers in North Africa to prevent refugees from reaching Germany. He also blamed migrants for wage suppression and cuts in social expenditures, and supported restrictions on their access to the social welfare system. Whereas the Bloc targeted La Fontaine for his policies and positions, these were not seen as mere personal failures, but rather the result of systematic pressures. Instead of facing and confronting these structural conflicts and contradictions of capitalism, they argued, La Fontaine sought to, quote, solve, end quote, them within the framework of nation states. In the end, this approach, quote, comes to its logical conclusion, end quote, that, quote, in this society, social provisions belong only to national citizens alone, end quote, to those of this nation state, quote, and the rest of the world must be kept out with force, end quote. The criticized La Fontaine wrote in his own words, quote, in a modern nation, the responsibilities of the state must be guaranteed, above all, to care for those who are its citizens and for those who contribute to the finances of the community, end quote. According to this logic, the state is obligated to, quote, protect its citizens and prevent parents from becoming unemployed because of foreign workers who take their jobs for low pay, end quote. Resurgence of nationalism. Nationalism has been a long-standing historical challenge for the left. Yet while critiques of nationalism have been articulated by various left figures throughout the 20th century, the emergence of an explicitly anti-national tendency in social movement discourse only first emerged in response to the political conjuncture that began with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Previously, the dominant left orientation relied on a positive affirmation of the, quote, nation, end quote. The old left's call for proletarian internationalism sought to build solidarity between different national working classes, while the new left's anti-imperialism meant supporting, quote, national self-determination, end quote, in the global South. With the opening of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent, quote, German reunification, end quote, a strong resurgence of nationalism was felt in both East and West German states. It came not only in the guise of neo-fascism, which erupted across Europe, but in popular nationalist euphoria across the political spectrum. It was not limited to the German province, but advanced the mainstream press as well as in policy decisions, strengthening the national border and the ethnic character of the state, and justifying Germany's geopolitical goals on the international level. Rejection of the nation-state. An anti-national critique was born in the struggles of social movements against this nationalist wave. Not only did these movements reject nationalism, understood as national chauvinism or national antagonism, but also nationalism's foundation, quote, the nation, end quote, and the nation-state as such. This represented a clear break with the left's inherited position on nationalism. The anti-national tendency that emerged in the post-1989 setting had a negative orientation toward the nation. For them, the nation-state was the engine of nationalism, not the means for overcoming nationalism. In no shape or form could, quote, the nation, end quote, be the social force that could overthrow capitalism. Nor could it herald in an emancipatory social order even exist in a post-capitalist society. The abolition of capitalism could not coincide with the nation. In response to the nationalist resurgence of the 1990s, anti-fascist and anti-racist perspectives took on an increasing importance for the left. Each had their limitations. While anti-fascism became a pole of identification for many social movement participants in the early 1990s, the anti-fascist action groups sprung up out of the ground to combat the burgeoning neo-Nazi movement. Anti-fascism was circumscribed by a narrow focus on the fascist movement and ideology. Confronting the broader and more complex nationalist resurgence required new analytical tools and forms of political intervention. Solidarity and anti-racism as tools. Anti-racism was also a central perspective for the protest movements of this period and linked to a variety of projects, including direct support for refugees and victims of racist violence and countering the re-nationalization of collective identity during and immediately following the, quote, unification, end quote, process. Yet this perspective could not address the power ambitions of the expanded Germany in the new geopolitical situation. closely connected to the logic of international capitalist competition between states. The, quote, colonization of Eastern Europe, end quote, as the movement described the German state's international political ambitions, was not based on racial ideologies. It was in this context that a specifically anti-national perspective therefore emerged to address a wide variety of social and political developments. It incorporated both anti-fascism and anti-racism, yet transcended both of them with the aim of grasping a broader and more fundamental political dynamic centered around the German nation-state in the post-socialist world. One second. Excuse me. It was in this context that a specifically anti-national perspective therefore emerged to address a wide variety of social and political developments. It incorporated both anti-fascism and anti-racism, yet transcended both of them with the aim of grasping a broader and more fundamental political dynamic centered around the German nation-state in the post-socialist period. A fundamental reorientation. The anti-national left was therefore not the product of abstract theoretical reflections. Rather, it emerged out of the concrete struggles against resurgent nationalism in the country during, quote, German unification. Those involved in this small radical left tendency insisted that the new social and political terrain required the formulation of new political questions. The result of this practical and theoretical engagement was not an amended leftist worldview in which the inherited tenets would be supplemented with an opposition to the nation. Instead, the encounter with nationalism resulted in a fundamental reorientation of a broad set of political assumptions and produced a deep restructuring in the content and contours of left politics and practice. As a result, the established left position on nationalism, which viewed it as nothing more than a form of propaganda used by manipulative elites to gain popular support, was contradicted by the clear production of nationalism from below through the push for, quote, unification, end quote, amongst the general population and the swelling in popular racism. The view that nationalism is merely the distortion of an otherwise positive collective expression which the left could simply redirect towards the, quote, correct targets, end quote, was revealed as a dangerous delusion in the face of extreme violence against asylum seekers and immigrants in the early 1990s, and the popular support for harsh restrictions on migration. As a result, the anti-national debates broke the bounds of a neatly defined concept of nationalism and began to interrogate the topic of the nation and nation-state more intensely.